Hello, and welcome to this, the Savage Balance Podcast. Hey, hello everyone. How you all doing? Welcome to this, episode number 16 of the Savage Balance Podcast. I hope you're all coping well during the third lockdown in the UK at the very least. This is quite a long conversation, so I'm going to keep the intro and outro quite brief as it's really dense with information. I recorded a conversation last week with Klina Jordan. Klina is the co-founder and chief executive of Make Votes Matter, although I did call them Making Votes Matter, despite the fact that Klina had a huge poster behind their head saying Make Votes Matter, and I'd already been talking to them for 10 minutes. I still made that mistake. Anyway, Make Votes Matter is a cross-party campaign to replace the voting system in the House of Commons in the UK from first past the post to proportional representation. Don't worry too much if you're not too sure what those terms mean. It's something we address in the podcast. Essentially, it's about making your vote count and sort of actually mean something more than it does in the system we have at the moment. But we'll get into that in the podcast. We talk about many, many things. We talk about our broken voting system, proportional representation, as well as referendums, citizens' assemblies, House of Lords, politicians. And Klina actually addresses some of my concerns with proportional representation, which was wonderful, really. They were a wonderful person, and I've wanted to set this up for many months, but we finally got it recorded on the 26th of January, 2021. As I say, this is a long episode, so I recommend pausing this now, grabbing a pen and paper, having those at the ready, because you may want to take notes during this, as it's just dense with information. Anyway, I said I wanted to keep it brief, so here we are. This is episode number 16, Making Votes Matter, with Klina Jordan. So I'm joined today by Klina from Making Votes Matter, or Make Votes Matter, apologies. How are you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. It's good to meet you.
Yeah, lovely to meet you too. We've been planning to do this for a while and things have got in the way, so it's nice to be sitting down and actually doing this at this point. I thought a good place to start would be just describing and talking a little bit about our current political system and what you perceive to be unfair about it, because I remember a post around about the end of, or an email that you sent through comparing the US results with the UK results, and I remember that, and that might be a good place to jump off from. But yeah, just a little description about what you feel is unfair about our political system, voting system at the moment.
Yeah, so basically in the UK and in the US for their electoral college, we use a system for counting votes called first past the post. This actually was born of horse racing terminology, and first past the post was outlawed by the Jockey Club sometime, I think in the 19th century, because it led to way too much cheating. So people would have kind of dodgy bets and they'd do all sorts of dodgy things to make sure particular horses won or particular horses lost, and yet we're still saddled, unintended pun, with that system for our politics. And it wasn't even good enough for horse racing back then, and politics shouldn't be a horse race. It shouldn't be about one takes all of the power and everyone else is left with nothing. We should have democracy, and democracy comes from the Greek demos and kratos, which is people and power, and so the people should be in power. Everybody should be represented. So the way first past the post works in terms of a political system is that you divide a country or the area that you're talking about into regions. So in the UK, that's constituencies. And then the candidate with the most votes in that constituency wins, which just as a first thought sounds all right, like surely the one with the most should win. But as I've just explained, actually, it shouldn't be a matter of one person taking all of the power. And when you then multiply that up across the whole country, you end up with lots of people, many of whom don't even have 50% of the vote, and all of whom have to have kind of like, I think in the UK we've gone down to about 24%ish of the vote. I might not be getting the number exactly right. But if you imagine there's a party that polls at 10% across the country, then they're never going to get a seat in that scenario, because they're always going to get fewer votes than the number required to be the MP in that one constituency. And so you get a system that really massively distorts what the people want. And first past the post has been absolutely conclusively proven to give an advantage to the two biggest parties. And even more than that, it gives an advantage to the biggest party. And in the UK, that's the Conservative Party. And first past the post has been shown from studies across the world to result in more right-wing outcomes than the voters voted for. And there are reasons for that, which I won't go into now. But basically, we've got a system where a vast majority of votes are wasted. And when we say wasted in this context, and that's a political science term, it means that those votes went to losing candidates, or they went to candidates who already had enough votes to win. And so then they've got this massive mountain surplus above the amount that they needed to win. And what we see is often in cities, the Labour Party gets those kind of vote mountains, but it doesn't affect their standing overall in the country. So just on the topic of the different parties, Make Votes Matter is completely cross-party, and we want Conservative voters to have as many MPs as they've voted for proportionally. We want the Labour Party to have the same, and all of the other parties to have the same. So this absolutely isn't an anti-Tory thing. It's not fair Labour benefit kind of thing. It's just about having a fair outcome, basically. So if a party gets 20% of the votes, they get 20% of the seats in Parliament, and people actually are represented by people who they voted for. And the really important thing about that is you get better outcomes. So we can move on to talk about that in a minute, but I'm aware I've talked for a while, so back to you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, because I mean, it's not a secret. I'm a member of the Green Party, so it's a big issue with them, and I get it. But I think back to the election in 2015 when UKIP got 12.5% of the vote share, which was about 4 times as many as the Green Party, and both of those equated to 1 seat each in Parliament. And you think that's an eighth of the people who voted for one particular party, albeit a party that I have strong disagreements with, but it did not equate to 1/8 of the power. It equated to 350th of the power, which feels very much unfair in like you say, in a democratic society. Which I guess is what you talk about really with proportional representation. Because I've heard people say about one place that could be useful, one reason that first past the post might work as a system is if it is literally a 2-party system. You have one party and another party, and as you go through that, they sort of even each other out, and it works out fine. But as we saw in 2010, like the Lib Dems, a third party, had a massive sway over who was in government after that election. So maybe there's maybe it's a good point to jump into say about what proportional representation is, and maybe also talk about, as you say, democracy, meaning people and power, how proportional representation gives local communities and local people more power.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's also worth pointing out that while first past the post kind of worked when it was mainly a 2-party system, what it does is it forces countries into those 2-party situations, because you know that your candidate isn't going to win unless it's one of those 2 parties' candidates. And so particularly in the States, it's very much a 2-party system, because other parties just can't get a look in, basically. And it also doesn't work for a two-party system, because there have been times where we get wrong winner elections. So there have been two in the UK, in fact. One, I think, in the 50s and one in the 70s. At one time, the Tories got more votes than the Labour Party, and yet lost, and the other time vice versa. Right. And of course, when Trump beat Hillary Clinton, actually he lost the popular vote. And so for me, people power certainly is not, you can't call a system where you get the wrong winner and say that's people power, that's democracy. So all of the talk about democracy in the States, I find quite bizarre. I mean, my personal opinion is that we do not have democracy yet in the basic form in the UK or the US. Like, we've got a semblance, we're working towards it. And it's been a long path to get there, and there are setbacks along the way, but generally over time we get closer. So yeah, we very much believe that this is the next big step in kind of extending the franchise so that everybody has a vote that really matters. And in terms of what is proportional representation, it is simply that seats match votes, or kind of roughly or largely. So different voting systems are proportional to lesser or greater extents. And so we've actually got proportional systems in various parts of the UK already. So for the London Assembly, and for Holyrood, and for the Senedd in Wales and in Northern Ireland. And previously we had it as well for our European Parliament elections. And there are different versions of PR which are used in different places. So the additional member system is used in quite a few of those places I've just said, but also the single transferable vote system is used, for example, in local elections in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And they're different ways of counting up votes, and so they have slightly different outcomes. And what's happened for many, many years is that people who are campaigning for proportional representation get very caught up in a systems debate, which is, it gets very quickly into the kind of technicalities and the mathematics. And like, I prefer like having multi-member districts, or I like preferential voting. And you get away from the action that needs to be taken to actually bring about the change. So what we did at Make Votes Matter over the course of about a year and a half was, with our alliance, which includes all of the British opposition parties aside from Labour. So basically it's most of the parliamentary parties. It's just the Tories, Labour and DUP who aren't yet on board. And we got them and a load of other democracy organisations and public figures to agree on a good systems agreement, which basically sets out the principles of good voting systems. And that was based on various national consultations about the best way to do voting systems. And so the outcome is it's very condensed down from these huge long wordy documents. So we've actually got a 10 bullet point list of what good voting systems look like. And key to that is proportionality. But we've also got things in there like maintaining a local link, so that you are represented by somebody from your area or multiple people from your area. And that if any lists are going to be used, because various voting systems use lists, some for top-ups, that those are determined democratically. So it's not the party bosses who get to decide who's at the top of the list. And the key bit about that agreement is not about the details of the voting system. It's actually about how it gets chosen. And so we've got agreement from all of those parties and organisations that the best system for the UK would best be chosen via a citizen-led, truly informed, deliberative process. So something like a citizens' assembly. It could be something slightly different. It could be part of a constitutional convention, but it needs to be citizen-led. And so we're always trying to steer the conversation away from the huge systems debates that are available, and just keep it on the topic of how we actually bring about the change.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I totally understand that. A few common criticisms I've heard around this. I'm interested to hear your response to them. That because when you start talking about mainly challenging the voting system that we have at the moment, people start saying that to challenge it is undemocratic, or to say, people died for your vote and it's an insult to their vote not to vote and stuff. And specifically with proportional representation, your people have said, like, you're going to let the wrong people in. Are there common criticisms that you've heard in your position in Make Votes Matter, either any of those or other ones that you've heard of, and what would your responses be to those?
Interestingly, that's not one I've heard very much. So you've obviously heard some feedback, which I don't hear so often. As I said, like extending the vote so that each vote counts equally, so that the franchise is fully extended, to me, that is just another step in the process, from all of the things that have happened before. Like we had a king, and then some lords got some power, and then that kind of managed to get a little bit further spread out. And each stage, people have fought, like really fought. Like there's been violence in the past around elections. And it's great now that we don't normally have violence at polling stations, for example. For men without property to then have the vote, for some women to then get the vote, etc. So we've had this kind of long process, and each step along the way, there have been people who said, no, this would just destroy everything. We can't possibly let those people have a say. They'll choose the wrong thing. Women, they don't know what they're talking about. Don't let them in. But actually, the reality is that the decisions made by government affect everybody in the country. And everybody in the country is best placed to know what's best for them. So each person has a slightly different view, and all of that should be feeding into the whole decision-making process. So that's really important. So no, I haven't heard that one before. We do often hear things like, oh, it will let the extremists in. And the reality is that, yes, if you have a proportional voting system, and there are enough, I'm going to do this in speech marks, extremists to get however many % of the vote is needed to get one seat, and that will vary from country to country. But if you can get one seat, then yes, you will be, that view will be represented. But what I say is, first of all, it's very convenient for the mainstream to label more fringe views as extremists. And actually, they're just different. And in my personal view, we should always be listening to all of the views to come to a better conclusion and better outcome. And when those views are represented in Parliament, then they can be put under the proper scrutiny. And I think what's happened where we've falsely kept people out, so you mentioned UKIP back in 2015 and the Greens, where they're kept out, those views aren't heard and they're not put under scrutiny. And I think where there are falsehoods being peddled, which is obviously quite a thing these days, alternative facts and all of that, then that can't be called out. So the whole resentment that was bubbling around the EU, that wasn't aired in the proper way in Parliament. And the whole process might have gone quite differently if it had been. And I'm not kind of segueing straight from falsehoods to wanting to leave the EU in an intentional way. I'm just saying that there could have been a much more informed debate with those voices there were valid points of view as well. If they had been heard, then we wouldn't have maybe gone through this complete shenanigans that we've gone through for the last few years. We could have maybe sooner come to a compromise that worked for most people, whereas what we've now got is a solution that a very small subsection of the population would have chosen if they'd been given all of the options. But I digress into Brexit, and Make First Matter doesn't take a position on Brexit. We just think that democracy should happen properly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful to be cross-party, and it will be interesting to hear. Well, you already mentioned actually the parties that did, and it's great hearing Labour more recently in the last year or so, at least certain figures in Labour being more interested in it as a genuine prospect. But you touched on a lot of things, which was a question I was going to get to, which is about really, because I am all in favour of proportional representation, especially in the system we've got. So I'd really like to get your perspective on this idea of the work of government, the fact that it's quite a slow process, there's large infrastructure that spans decades, climate emergency, economic crises and stuff like that. That combined with sort of outside interests, like I guess before the EU more than it is now, and NATO and IMF and the World Bank, and the role of governments is becoming more, I think, fractured and its power outsourced and sort of limited to non-elected, non-governmental bodies like multinational corporations and stuff who have a huge sway in democracies and stuff. And I just think with all that in mind, and what you mentioned earlier about the populist kind of rhetoric and, well, labelled as extremist, and with fears around fake news and, deep fake technology coming more and more, does this, and the fact that elections also are often fought on images rather than policy. It's more of an image campaign or a marketing campaign than it is about policy and governing. I was wondering if this could lead to a more volatile and less efficient and less effective long-term government with more. That's kind of my fear, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that's a question. It's just a bunch of thoughts.
No, I hear you. I could certainly talk about that. I think it's very clear there's a lot of evidence that first past the post systems result in much wilder policy swings, because you basically are on a seesaw. It's red or blue, and be that whichever party in whichever country. I'm mainly thinking about the UK and the USA. It is worth mentioning other countries do have this voting system, but they're in a tiny minority. Most democracies use systems of proportional representation. So some of the other unfortunate ex-colonies, because it's basically ex-colonies that have first past the post, other ones are Canada and India, so they're the other kind of really significant ones, and they also have campaigns to get rid of it. So yeah, in terms of the stability of government, again, there's a lot of evidence around that, and countries with first past the post, I believe the last time I looked at it, have elections slightly more often than proportional representation countries. And of course there are outliers, and people always point at Italy and Israel and Ireland when they're saying they don't like PR. But they're all quite specific examples, kind of other cultural or religious factors going on in those countries, or constitutional issues in the case of Italy, where it was intentionally designed so that one group couldn't have power for too long. I won't start talking about Italy because I don't know enough about it, but they're not the standard examples of proportional representation. If you do look at the graphs of all sorts of different indices, so outcomes around climate, around environmental legislation in general, about social equality, about actually whether countries go to war more or not, these are all linked with proportional representation. And there are a whole load of studies which actually say that these aren't just correlations, they're causal. And so for me, that's the really important thing. And my background is actually in environmental campaigning, and I worked in sustainable enterprise for years, and I've always been an activist. And you eventually realise that you can't take the action that's so urgently needed about the climate crisis without changing the system. And that's why, of course, the Green Party is so on board about all of this, and as many other parties are as well. So yeah, much more stable government, and you were saying about image as well, and one thing that sprung to mind is that there was some study about the hair of the candidate and the likelihood of them becoming president of the United States. And I can't remember the details, but it was basically like, if you've got kind of a good head of hair, like if you look good, you're much more likely to be elected. But I'd have to fish that out again and find out exactly what it was that it said.
Yeah, there's even proven things before psychological wise, where people have said that we tend to be more trusting of people who are, I guess, societally seen as attractive as opposed to not. And they've compared this through sentencing, through people who've, criminal activities and then go into trial, and depending on their sentences, like more attractive, again in inverted commas for me, people tend to get a less of a sentence than the opposite way, which is really interesting. And then I guess applying that thought further out to this person you're trusting to run the country, and so much of it to me seems about marketing. In fact, I wrote down a thing, and I've heard before that election it's not really about politics, it's only about marketing in ways of like overexposure to trivial things. Like I definitely saw a lot of Boris Johnson likes a good a nice good sort of trivial, driving that I can't remember what it was, like that truck through all those boxes that said
Polystyrene.
yeah, and a picture of him in boxing gloves saying "Get Brexit done." He likes that feels a lot to me like how a lot of elections are fought these days, very much to do with images as opposed to policy, and policy becomes second nature, and people saying, "Oh, I don't trust that person as much as that person," as opposed to taking a whole party perspective on things.
Yeah. I think what you're saying about the marketing, that's very much linked with the kind of unduly excessive influence of money in politics. And we also know that like, those with more money are far more likely to win elections because they can get their message heard much better. And if that's kind of mainstream advertising, then yes, the imagery in that is key. And there was a referendum on the voting system in 2011, and for a whole series of reasons, it wasn't actually about switching to proportional representation. The alternative to first past the post that was offered was a system called the alternative vote, which some think is more democratic. And I would agree that basically the winner has to have at least 50% of the vote. So in that sense, it's more democratic, but it can be even less proportional than first past the post. So for that referendum, there was this huge amount of money poured into an advertising campaign against the alternative vote. And they had these big posters, these billboards on the tubes and all sorts, with like a picture of a baby in an incubator, that like the strapline was something like, should we save this baby's life or should we change the voting system? And then there was one of a soldier in a war zone and saying, should we have the right protective equipment for this soldier or should we change the voting system? So they were making out that it was going to be a really expensive change, which is actually not true. But people saw those images, and of course you want the baby to survive. So it's completely irrelevant to the question in hand, but the image, it really plays a role, and that's put in front of you because of the money. And so that's one of the many things that's not yet good enough about our democracy or our pseudo-democracy. The money needs to be regulated in relation to politics, and it's done much better in many other democracies.
That's interesting. I do want to, before we wrap up, get onto different voting systems and such first. But just before, while we're on the image stuff, I sort of think about the role of the politician. The idea is sort of about being of service. You're of service to your community, to your constituents, to your country, and almost like I almost see it as, I remember hearing about certain monks who don't get any money, so they're completely dependent on their local community to sort of offer them food and shelter and other such things, so that every decision they make is reliant, because there is a definite symbiosis. And I think about that in terms of a politician, in which it's a fully built career, in which you are sort of defending this kind of brand that you have, this brand awareness, and ideally for them conserving power. That's a sign of a job well done. Does PR do anything, or proportional representation do anything to address this form of campaigning? And I guess one of the things I think about when I ask that question is, a lot of times people set themselves up as the rival to that candidate, sort of like get the Tories out of this area, for example. I see a lot. Whereas, so again, they're focusing sort of on image rather than on policy, and saying, here's my set of views, and see if that correlates with your view of or reflection of society.
Yeah, so in terms of what PR does, in terms of entrenched representatives like MPs, kind of a seat for life, career politicians, it means that like the way that the people vote will actually be reflected. And there are a huge number of safe seats in the UK. And actually, one of the things we're looking at the moment is a messaging process whereby we want to rebrand some of these terms. Like a safe seat sounds like a good thing, right? but it's safe for the MP and it's not for the constituents, because then they're not being represented. So yes, for example, if you had an STV system, a single transferable vote system, and that might bring us on to the next question, you would have multiple representatives in a constituency. So you might have 5 MPs in the constituency, and if that place was somewhere where the Tory or always won because they got 40% of the vote, just to pick an easy number, in that scenario you might have 2 Tory MPs, kind of each with 20% of the vote or whatever kind of combination, and then you'd also have 3 other MPs to make up the other 60% of the vote, which normally wouldn't have been represented at all. That might be like 1 Labour, 1 Green, 1 Plaid Cymru, whatever. It's not a party specific example. It's more about the fact that you would actually have representation, and you would actually get to choose between the representatives. So if I'd voted Green, for example, and in my constituency I ended up with 2 Tories, 2 Labour, and 1 Plaid Cymru if I lived in Wales, it might be that I thought that one of the Labour MPs was the right person to talk to, who was really switched on to the Green New Deal. It might be that I wanted to talk to the Plaid Cymru person, but at least there'd be somebody there who more closely reflected my views than the Tories who had always held the seat, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely, I see exactly what you mean. I've moved around a few different places for different, been in different places for different elections, and there's a difference in the sort of the level of how engaged and connected you are with the place I'm living at the moment. In the last election, it was basically a safe seat for somebody, so I felt like I either vote for just with my heart, in a sense, and it's sort of meaningless, or I vote with that person to. I was thinking about these things, but I was thinking it doesn't matter what I do. That person's already got it. They've already got that majority. Whereas when I was living near Brighton, I was not in a safe seat. There was a challenge between 2, and I could be more engaged in that sense, and I could be more part of the dialogue, and felt like, I can actually physically go and do stuff. So where I am at the moment, which is in Norfolk, the closest place in which I felt like I could make a difference was in Bury St Edmunds, where they had a kind of a decent sort of Green following there. But that's a really long way out my way as well, so it's difficult to get to. There's all these extra things that gets brought up with it, and I think it would be nice to just be able to talk to my neighbours who I know and about these things, and see if we can share ideas and such like that. But I do want to get on to, because I'm half conscious of time. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I'm interested in where PR sits with alternative models, such as you mentioned citizens' assemblies earlier, or even things like sortition, or different anarchist systems. Where does PR sit with them? Do they sit quite well with those ideas?
Yeah, so I personally am all for citizens' assemblies and sortition. To me, proportional representation is the keystone that will enable us to put the other building blocks of democracy in place. While we've got this system that's so wildly disproportionate, it's actually really difficult to make the other changes. So there are very, very few people in this country who disagree with the fact that the House of Lords needs reforming. But of course, the House of Lords is in a position of power, and the House of Lords doesn't necessarily want to be reformed. It does increasingly, actually, but there are those who block attempts at reform, and the government is hell-bent on wedging in as many new peers as it can. And in fact, there's talk in the House of Lords about refusing the current, the government's allocations of new peers. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with all of that. But without having a representative government, parliament and government, government that comes out of the representative parliament, it's really hard to make those changes. And for me, the House of Lords would ideally be a sortition house. So there is actually a campaign for a House of Citizens in Scotland. So they already have proportional representation, and various organisations, including the Electoral Reform Society and Sortition Foundation, are pushing to have a sortition upper house. And I think that would be fantastic for the House of Lords, and it would provide a great counterbalance for a proportional primary legislative chamber, the House of Commons. Of course, there's a lot of people pushing for PR for the House of Lords, but I think that's actually very dangerous, because it's a kind of get out of jail free card where you say, well, we've put PR in the House of Lords, so we'll just carry on with first past the post for the Commons. And that's exactly what's happened in Australia, where they do have STV for the Senate, and they have which is proportional, and then they have the alternative vote, the one that we rejected in 2011 for the lower house. So yeah, I think all of those kinds of other types of democracy need to be brought in, and I actually like liquid democracy. To me, that's the end game. But like some of these things I'm saying, like about sortition for the House of Lords and liquid democracy, these are personal views rather than Make Votes Matter views, because we are a single issue campaign just for PR for the Commons, and that's because we do see it as the single most important change to improve our democracy.
Absolutely, yeah. What is well, I was going to ask what liquid democracy is, but just before that, I just wonder, is it true that the House of Lords is the? I read this before, but I don't know if the book's slightly out of date or not. Is it true that it's the House of Lords is the only Senate in the world where some seats are still hereditary? Is that true, or?
I think it might be. I'm not an expert on the House of Lords. I know that in China, it's one of the only unelected houses that's larger, and there might be one other. But yeah, it's pretty weird that we still get people getting seats in the House of Lords who get to make decisions who have those seats because whoever their father was, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
it's amazing when we talk about democracy. The idea that is still institutionalized is mad. You mentioned liquid democracy. What is liquid democracy? I don't know what that is.
Sure. So direct democracy is where you have people voting directly on legislation, so referendums. And in Switzerland, they have both proportional representation and direct democracy. So if enough people, so somebody can start a petition, and if enough people sign that petition, then they would actually have a referendum, a national referendum on that issue, and law would then be brought about as a consequence of the people making that decision. The referendum we had on our membership of the EU actually wasn't like that. It was meant to be advisory. And that's what part of all of the kerfuffle was about. People were saying, well, the people have spoken, you should listen to us, and other people saying, well, it's advisory only. So that's direct democracy, where the result of a referendum is actually implemented into law. What we have is representative democracy, or supposedly representative democracy. I'd call our current system unrepresentative. And liquid democracy is a blend between those two things. So instead of having an MP, you would have a delegate who could represent you. And you can, the nice thing about liquid democracy is it can be kind of any blend of the options that each person would want. So somebody might say, well, actually, I just want to set my preference and always vote for like one delegate to represent me for everything. Or somebody might say, well, I want to vote on issues around environment and education myself because I feel I'm informed enough to make those decisions directly. But actually, I'm not so bothered about policing or whatever it is that they're less interested in. Or they might be saying, I just don't know enough about those things. But there's that woman over there who's an expert on policing. So I'm going to choose her as a delegate to represent me on policing. So you could choose different people to represent you for different things. And the way it could work is, and this does exist in some parts of the world. I don't believe it's actually used for a national parliament or government anywhere yet, but liquid democracy is certainly in use. And so you could have your blend of somewhere between direct and representative democracy and change it as you wish as you go along. So you could have delegates vote on day one, and people could then see how they voted, and then however many days later everyone else could vote. So within that time you could take your vote away from your delegate and say, actually, I'm going to vote on this one myself because I think it's a bit complicated and my view is different to theirs. That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's fascinating. It's so exciting to hear about the different possibilities that there are in the just because you get so used to, especially if you're like we're born into sort of first past the post and how that's been working for, I mean, I'm assuming centuries or over a century. I'm not too sure actually how long.
But, yeah, well, in its current form, it's actually not that old. I can't remember what the date was, but somewhere around 100 years ago, the last multi-member constituencies were scrapped. Don't quote me on about 100 years, but actually we haven't had this kind of uniform single-member constituency situation for particularly long. People kind of claim that first past the post has been around for centuries and centuries, and it's just not true.
Right. Okay. I'm definitely conscious of time, so I do want to let you go. But I just want to ask one last thing about what you mentioned before about referendums. Is there different ways of working referendums to do with proportional represent? I guess it sort of is proportional representation, isn't it? Well, I'm not an expert on this. I already felt like I was out of my depth there.
Do you mean are there better ways of doing referendums?
Yeah, are there different ways of doing it?
I mean, the point of a referendum is that you will have a proportional outcome. So the trouble is, we've had referendums on quite binary issues, whereas I would say that, for example, our membership of the EU, it's not a binary question. And as we've seen since that referendum, there are kind of infinite permutations of arrangements that could be made between the UK and the EU. And that should have been spelt out. And it could have been that we had, for example, a preferential vote system for that referendum. Like, do you like option A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever? Rank them in order. So it could be A, C, B, E, D, whatever. So you wouldn't necessarily be saying, well, it's in or out, and I've only got one choice. But yeah, I mean, referendums, there are very big problems with the way we do referendums in the UK. One is about the excessive influence of money, which we know played a huge role in that EU referendum. And there are a whole range of other factors, like the Electoral Reform Society did a report about how undemocratic our referendums are. So yeah, they can certainly be done better. I think most parts of our democracy can be done better, but there are some really great developments, like citizens' assemblies are being used now more, and that's a good step in the right direction. And as I say, we are already using PR in a whole load of places, so having PR for the House of Commons is very much a matter of time. It's it when, not if. and we believe it can be within the next few years. And a large part of that equation is about getting the Labour Party on board. And so in the autumn, we launched a coalition project called Labour for a New Democracy, and that's got 11 organisations in it. Some of them are very much Labour focused, some like us are cross-party, but we're only working with Labour members to bring about the change in the Labour Party. So Labour members are raising motions at their constituency Labour parties, the local branches basically, and they're then putting those, there's then a vote at that CLP, and that's then put forward to the national party. And we're at 138 at the moment, I believe, which is a really significant number. We're over 20%, which is great. And there are kind of very few things which have so many motions for that. So we do believe that we can get Labour on board. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of prominent Labour MPs and politicians who are for proportionality. And in fact, proportionality results in a lot of the kind of outcomes that the Labour campaign is generally advocating. So more equality and better environmental outcomes and so on.
Perfect. That's fantastic. It's really lovely I remember it being a thing during the when they were looking for a new leader. I remember quite a few people, Clive Lewis in particular, saying having that as a kind of, maybe not forefront, but certainly a big part of how they saw Labour's future and I guess the country's future. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, well, Clive was great in that because he knew that he didn't have the political backing to win, but he stood in order to have that voice about democracy heard, and he thought that was really important. And by doing so, he completely shifted the nature of the debate. So then all of the other candidates who stayed in the race they basically all said positive things about PR to some extent or another, and not hugely committal, but we do believe that Keir Starmer is open to it and it's a political issue. So we're working to get that grassroots support and working with unions and so on so that we can actually change policy. And then, of course, it's fingers crossed to get a majority of pro-PR MPs elected who can then legislate to bring about the change.
Fantastic. You mentioned about grassroots there and getting people involved. How can people get involved with Make Votes Matter? I know that I've signed up to the I forgot what it's called, where you get the emails through, subscribe.
Join the movement.
Yes, yeah. So there's a lot of emails that are always coming through with things to do. But yeah, how can people get involved in Make Votes Matter?
Well, that would be the key thing, I'd say. So if you go to makevotesmatter.org.uk or just search Make Votes Matter, and then at the top there's a thing you can click to join the movement. And then you'll find out about whatever the current most important thing is that you could do. That might be signing a particular petition. For example, we did a Christmas card to Keir Starmer asking him to back PR, give us PR for Christmas. And so thousands of people signed that. It might be about taking a motion to your constituency Labour Party if you're a Labour member. It might be about joining your local group. It might be one of our upcoming action days. So we've got a lobby on the 12th of March. So that's our next action, a grassroots action, where we'll be getting people to go and meet their MPs on Zoom in groups with other constituents and to try and convince them to back PR. And people often think there's no point talking to Conservatives who don't seem to like PR, but we have had Conservative MPs change their mind as a result of constituent lobbying. So it is worth it for sure.
Always worth it, absolutely. I'm conscious of time and I'm conscious of those things. So I would like to thank you very much for your time. I feel like I've learned a lot. I didn't know about liquid democracy, and there's a lot of things that definitely helped me. And like I mentioned before, there was a couple of feelings I had about things, and it's really helped me gain a lot more perspective and open me up to other horizons as well, of other future things. And I hope people listening have got a lot of the same things out of it. And yeah, you're a very wonderful person. So thanks very much for your time.
It's lovely talking with you.
Yeah, it was really lovely talking with you. Great. Thank you. So there we are. That was a wonderful conversation there. Thank you very much to Klina there. What a wonderful, phenomenal, passionate, dedicated human being. They are pushing for a much needed change in this country. Yeah, wonderful. Just so dense with information, right? I didn't know anything about liquid democracies, and she had such wonderful views on sort of politicians and the whole political spectrum in general. Yeah, I think this is worth sharing with people. If you got something out of this, whether you lean to the left or the right, you're more central, or you're one of the number of growing individuals choosing not to vote, I think this is totally worth people getting involved in. It really is, a much fairer way of running democracy for all. So, get in touch with Make Votes Matter. There's plenty of ways you can do that. There's plenty of links, actually, in the show notes. One of them being the way you can join the movement as such with the Make Votes Matter. So you can click that link and they will send you useful, they'll send you sort of essays, and they'll send you useful information, but more importantly, sort of petitions you can sign and people you can get in touch with, and all of that stuff. So if you got something out of this conversation, I'd recommend clicking on that right now. It only takes a second to do so, and get that information and be involved in this. There's also that US-UK comparison piece that I mentioned at the beginning. There's something to that. Another article as well that they wrote about 13 million people in the UK not being represented directly in Parliament. There's also a couple of things that might be easy for people to share if a conversation like this is a bit too dense, if you want to whet someone's appetite first. There's a couple of things which sort of explain it in very much in layman's terms and show you really the idea of proportional representation. So, check those out. As I say, make sure you get involved with Make Votes Matter. Join the movement. They really are sort of pushing and leading the way and having some great results. So, yes, do that. And thank you very much again for Klina for their wonderful input and conversation, and just being a very lovely person as well. Thanks for listening to this, guys. Share this podcast with people. We have a social media, Savage Balance Podcast, and a Twitter at SavBalPod. There is an email address, savbalpod@gmail.com. Tell me your thoughts, tell me your feelings, any guests you want, any topics you want covered. Let me know. We have a website, savbalpod.com. Subscribe, comment, rate, and review. Especially a subscribe would be wonderful at this point. The artwork is by Dolly Gray. The music is by Danny Tonks. I will see you again next week for probably not a conversation with somebody, but just something I've been musing over the last couple of days. So I'll do some research and I'll give you a good quality podcast, that's for sure. That's all for now, guys. Take it easy. Enjoy your week, and I will see you next Tuesday. Bye for now.